Melbourne sells itself as Australia's most livable city. Laneway cafes, street art, a tram network that glides past Victorian terraces, a river walk lined with fairy lights. Tourists arrive with a checklist: Queen Victoria Market, the Shrine of Remembrance, a coffee on De Grave Street, a photo in Hosier Lane. They leave a few days later convinced they have seen the real Melbourne. They have not. Underneath the trams and the terraces, this city is built on bluestone quarried by prisoners, tunnels carved for storms and for secrets, an asylum turned into luxury apartments, and a river that has swallowed more people than anyone likes to admit. Locals know the shortcuts, the old names, the places you do not mention in front of visitors because the story behind them is too heavy for a weekend itinerary. In this video, we are counting down 12 things about Melbourne that locals rarely tell tourists. Stay until the end, because the final one still shapes how an entire suburb built its playground. So settle in, and let's begin. Beneath the streets of the CBD, a network of stormwater drains stretches for kilometres, wide enough in places to stand upright, and old enough that some sections still carry brick archways from the 19th century. Locals call this the drain system, and for decades it has been the playground of an underground exploration group known as the Cave Clan, founded in Melbourne in the 1980s. Members map hundreds of drains across the city, giving them names like Anzac, Elizabeth, and the Maze, and left behind graffiti markers only insiders could read. Tourists never hear about this world because access points are unmarked manhole covers and grates hidden behind car parks and laneways. The drains are not a novelty. Flash flooding during summer storms has killed people who were caught inside when water levels rose without warning, turning a narrow brick tunnel into a death trap within minutes. Melbourne's fire and emergency services still issue seasonal warnings about drain exploration, but the culture persists quietly, passed between small groups who trade coordinates instead of posting them online. Somewhere under the coffee shops and office towers tourists photograph every day, that hidden city is still there, dark, damp, and largely forgotten by the people walking above it. Local forums still occasionally share fresh photos from a recent trip below, always without exact coordinates, keeping the tradition of secrecy alive well into the smartphone era. In the northern suburb of Coburg stands a fortress of bluestone that once held some of Australia's most dangerous men. Pentridge Prison operated from 1851 until 1997, and locals still call it the College of Knowledge, a grim joke about what prisoners learned inside its walls. The prison was built using convict labour. The same men who quarried the stone often ended up serving time behind it. Conditions were brutal for over a century. H Division, the punishment block, held prisoners in solitary confinement in cells with no natural light, and stories of the treatment inside still circulate among Melbourne locals who grew up hearing them from parents and grandparents. Notorious inmates included the standover man Mark Chopper Reed, whose exploits later became local legend and a feature film. Executions were carried out on site, and for decades the bluestone walls symbolised the harshest end of the justice system in Victoria. Since its closure, developers have converted large sections into apartments, a cinema complex, and retail space, meaning tourists can now buy takeaway coffee in a building where men once faced the gallows, usually without any idea of what they are standing inside. Long before Pentridge, the colony's justice was carried out at the old Melbourne Jail on Russell Street, a bluestone building that still stands beside RMIT University today. Between 1845 and 1929, the jail carried out more than 100 executions by hanging, and its most famous prisoner remains the bushranger Ned Kelly, hanged there in November 1880 after his capture at Glenrowan. His skull went missing for decades after his death, sparking a mystery that was only partly resolved when remains were identified using DNA testing many years later, though controversy over what happened to parts of his body has never fully settled. Locals walking past the building on their way to class or work rarely stop to consider that the narrow cells inside once held condemned prisoners counting down their final nights. The jail is now a museum offering night tours, and staff report visitors describing cold spots and unexplained sounds in the upper cell block, the section where the most violent offenders were once held before their execution. For a city known for its coffee culture, the jail is a blunt reminder of how recently public hangings were part of everyday Melbourne life. Locals taking friends on a night tour often watch first-time visitors go pale in the same narrow condemned cell, a small local ritual most tourists never realise is happening. In the leafy eastern suburb of Kew, a cluster of grand Victorian buildings now sells as boutique apartments under the name Willsmere. Few residents advertise what the site used to be. Kew Lunatic Asylum opened in 1872 and quickly became one of the largest psychiatric institutions in the colony, built to house patients suffering from conditions ranging from severe mental illness to what would today be recognised as depression, epilepsy, or postnatal trauma. At its peak, overcrowding was severe, with corridors used as makeshift sleeping areas and treatments that included restraint and isolation. The asylum operated for over a century before deinstitutionalization policies in the late 20th century saw patients moved into community care and the buildings left largely empty. Redevelopment in the 1990s converted the wards into apartments, preserving the ornate facades while erasing most physical trace of what happened inside them. Locals who grew up nearby remember the buildings standing derelict through the 1980s, windows broken, corridors littered with old patient files. Today, young professionals pay premium rent for heritage character, often unaware that their living room may once have been a ward where patients were confined for decades without ever leaving the grounds. In the leafy eastern suburb of Kew, a cluster of grand Victorian buildings now sells as boutique apartments under the name Willsmere. Few residents advertise what the site used to be. Kew Lunatic Asylum opened in 1872 and quickly became one of the largest psychiatric institutions in the colony, built to house patients suffering from conditions ranging from severe mental illness to what would today be recognized as depression, epilepsy, or postnatal trauma. At its peak, overcrowding was severe, with corridors used as makeshift sleeping areas and treatments that included restraint and isolation. The asylum operated for over a century before deinstitutionalization policies in the late 20th century saw patients moved into community care and the buildings left largely empty. Redevelopment in the 1990s converted the wards into apartments, preserving the ornate facades while erasing most physical trace of what happened inside them. Locals who grew up nearby remember the buildings standing derelict through the 1980s, windows broken, corridors littered with old patient files. Today, young professionals pay premium rent for heritage character, often unaware that their living room may once have been a ward where patients were confined for decades without ever leaving the grounds. On a winter afternoon in November 1897, a fire broke out at Young Husband's wool store near Spencer Street in West Melbourne, and it became one of the deadliest disasters in the city's firefighting history. The building was packed with highly flammable wool bales, and when the fire brigade arrived, the blaze escalated with terrifying speed. A wall collapsed during the operation, killing several firefighters instantly and injuring many more, a tragedy that shocked the colony and led directly to reforms in fire brigade safety procedures across Victoria. Melbourne's early industrial district along the Yarra was filled with warehouses just like Young Husband's, tightly packed timber and brick structures with little separating one blaze from the next building. Locals with family connections to the fire service still know the story, and a memorial exists for the firefighters who died, but most visitors walking through the now gentrified docklands and warehouse conversions nearby have no idea that the polished apartment blocks and craft breweries sit close to the site of one of the worst tragedies in the city's emergency services history. Flinders Street Station is the most photographed building in Melbourne, its dome and clocks instantly recognisable to every tourist who arrives by train. Almost none of them know that the upper floors, closed to the public since the 1980s, once contain a ballroom, a lecture hall, meeting rooms, and even a table tennis and badminton hall used by railway staff and city clubs for decades. These spaces fell into disuse as railway operations modernised, and by the late 20th century entire floors sat empty above the busy platforms, gathering dust while millions of commuters passed beneath them every year. Locals who have taken part in Rare Heritage Open Days describe walking through rooms with ornate ceilings and dance floors preserved almost exactly as they were left, a hidden world suspended above one of the busiest transport hubs in the Southern Hemisphere. Restoration efforts have been proposed repeatedly over the years, with plans to reopen sections as event spaces or a museum, but progress has been slow and much of the upper station remains closed. Tourists snap photos of the famous clocks below, never imagining an abandoned ballroom sits just above their heads, silent and dust-covered while thousands of commuters pass through the platforms underneath it every single hour. St Kilda today markets itself with palm trees, a famous cake shop strip, and views across Port Phillip Bay, but locals who grew up in Melbourne through the 1990s and 2000s remember a very different reputation. The suburb was long associated with Melbourne's underworld, red light activity along Grey Street, and later became a backdrop during the Gangland War that gripped the city between 1998 and 2010, a period in which more than 30 organised crime figures were killed across Greater Melbourne. Figures like Carl Williams became household names for locals following the killings in the news, while Chopper Red, before his death, gave interviews describing the district's criminal history with characteristic bravado. Some of the shootings and disappearances connected to that era took place within walking distance of the beachfront tourists now associate with sunset photos and gelato. Melbourne's true crime culture runs deep, with locals able to point out specific streets and buildings connected to unsolved cases, information that rarely appears in any tourist guide promoting St Kilda's cafes and its famous Luna Park entrance. The Yarra River is one of Melbourne's defining landmarks, its brown colour the subject of endless jokes among locals, most of whom will tell you it comes from natural sediment rather than pollution. What locals discuss far less is the river's long history as a site of drownings, both accidental and deliberate, stretching back well over a century. Victoria Police maintain a dedicated water police unit partly because recoveries from the Yarra remain a regular part of their work, and locals who live near the river's edge have learned to treat its calm surface with caution, particularly around bridges and weirs where currents beneath the water move faster than they appear. Historical accounts describe the river as a place where the city's less fortunate residents sometimes ended their lives during economic downturns in the early 20th century, and more recent cases continue to draw local news coverage that rarely reaches international visitors. Tourists take photos from the South Bank Promenade at sunset, admiring reflections of the skyline, largely unaware that the water beneath them carries a far darker history than its famous murky colour alone suggests, one locals learn about slowly, story by story, rather than all at once. North of the city centre, Coburg Lake Reserve looks like an ordinary suburban park, with walking paths, picnic tables, and families feeding ducks on weekends. Few visitors realise the lake itself began as a bluestone quarry, one of many dug across Melbourne's northern suburbs during the 19th century to supply the stone used in buildings like Pentridge Prison just down the road. When quarrying stopped, the deep pit was left to fill naturally with groundwater and rain, creating a lake with steep, unstable underwater walls and pockets of extreme depth close to the shoreline. Locals have long treated the lake with caution, aware of a history of drownings linked to the quarry's hidden drop-offs, places where the lake bed disappears suddenly just metres from where children wade in the shallows. Warning signs exist around parts of the reserve, but the lake's calm, park-like appearance disguises the danger beneath the surface. It is a pattern repeated across several former quarry sites in Melbourne's north, ordinary-looking waterways with industrial pasts that locals quietly warn each other about and tourists have simply never heard mentioned. Beneath the restaurants and lantern-strung streets of Melbourne's Chinatown, one of the oldest continuous Chinese settlements in the Western world, a network of basements and connecting passages tells a story rarely shared with visitors. During the gold rush era of the 1850s and 1860s, Chinese immigrants faced intense racial hostility, including violent raids and discriminatory laws designed to restrict their movement and livelihoods. Basement spaces beneath Little Bourke Street were reportedly used to move between buildings without being seen from the street, allowing residents to avoid confrontation during periods of heightened tension. Some of these connected spaces still exist today, repurposed as storage or hidden away behind restaurant kitchens, remnants of a defensive network built out of necessity rather than convenience. The Chinese Museum on Cohen Place preserves some of this history publicly, but much of what locals know about the underground passages comes from family stories passed down through generations rather than official signage. Tourists wandering Chinatown for dumplings and lanterns rarely learn that the precinct's charm was built on a foundation of survival against organised violence, and that traces of that resistance still sit quietly beneath their feet, hidden behind kitchen doors most visitors never think to look past. Every summer, thousands of families walk through the giant grinning face of Mr. Moon at the entrance to Luna Park in St Kilda, unaware they are walking into one of Melbourne's oldest and strangest local secrets. The park opened in 1912, and its scenic railway remains the oldest continually operating roller coaster in the world, a wooden structure that still requires a brakeman to ride alongside every carriage because the coaster has no automated braking system, a detail almost no tourist is told before boarding. Over the decades, the park has recorded several serious incidents and at least one fatality on its rides, details that long-time locals discuss far more openly than the park's own marketing material. Mr. Moon's face itself has been rebuilt multiple times after fires and renovations, and older residents remember earlier, more unsettling versions of the design before it was softened for modern audiences. St Kilda built its entire identity as a seaside entertainment suburb around this one attraction, shaping the streets, trams, and cafes that grew up alongside it for over a century. Locals see Mr. Moon as a piece of family nostalgia layered over a slightly eerie history, and it is exactly the kind of place that shows how much of Melbourne's charm was built directly on top of its darker, quieter stories. That is the pattern across this entire city. A prison becomes an apartment block. An asylum becomes a boutique address. A quarry becomes a picnic spot. A wool store fire becomes a craft brewery's neighbour. Melbourne does not hide its history so much as build gently over it, leaving locals as the only ones who remember what used to be there before the renovation, before the rebrand, before the new coat of paint. Tourists will keep taking photos of the trams and the laneways, and they are not wrong to love this city for what it has become. But next time you are handed a coffee in a converted bluestone building, or you walk past a cheerful park on your way to the beach, Remember that Melbourne locals are quietly holding a different version of the story, one they only tell if you know enough to ask. If this video showed you a side of Melbourne you never expected, share it with someone who thinks they already know this city, and subscribe for the next one, because this was only the beginning of what locals do not tell tourists.